Nico walked barefoot through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, his small feet brushing against the cool, cracked pavement. The only sound was the faint hum of streetlights flickering far down the road, casting a dim, unsteady glow on the empty street. It was as though the night itself was tired, weighed down by the silence. At 10 years old, Nico had grown accustomed to the calm of the night, when the world seemed to slow down. The street, which would scare most people, felt like a safe haven to him. Here there were no loud arguments, no shouting voices, just peace. For days, he had survived on bits of leftover food from the trash or small kind offerings from neighbors who pitied him. Tonight, as always, he was hungry. He decided to check the alley at the end of the block, where the garbage cans were usually piled high. He knew there might be nothing there, but still, he couldn't help but feel the need to look. As Nico neared the end of the alley, he heard a small sound, barely louder than a breath. It was a soft whimper, coming from somewhere in the shadows. Nico stopped, his heart beating a little faster, listening carefully. The sound came again, a faint cry that tugged at something deep inside him. He followed the noise, his curiosity growing. In the corner of the alley, where the darkness seemed thicker than usual, Nico spotted something small and trembling. At first it was hard to make out what it was, but as his eyes adjusted to the low light, he saw it. A tiny, scrawny puppy, curled up on a damp piece of cardboard. It looked so fragile, shivering in the cold. Its fur clumped and dirty, and its body was thin, almost too thin. Nico knelt down slowly, careful not to startle the puppy. He stretched out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. The puppy lifted its head, its large, fearful eyes locking with Nico's. The dirt-covered little creature looked like it had given up on ever being loved. Nico could see himself in those sad, searching eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had known too much hardship. "Hey there, little one," Nico whispered softly. His voice barely rose above the quiet of the night. The puppy continued to shake, its tiny body quivering like a leaf in the wind, but it didn't run away. It just stared at him, uncertain but not completely afraid. Nico felt a rush of compassion, and something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of stale bread, the last bit he had saved from earlier. He broke it in half, holding one part out to the puppy. "It's not much," he said, his voice soft, "but it's all I've got." The puppy sniffed the bread carefully, its nose twitching. After a moment, it began to eat, eagerly tearing at the dry bread, the hunger obvious in its small, desperate bites. Nico sat down next to the puppy on the cold, hard ground, watching as it devoured the food. The night air bit at his skin, but for a brief moment he didn't feel the cold. His heart warmed as he saw the puppy eating, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. For once, he had given something. For once, he had done something good. He watched the puppy's frail body as it ate, noticing how its once white fur was caked in dirt, how its ribs poked out under its skin, but there was something in its eyes, something bright, even in the dim light. Nico recognized that spark. It was the same flicker of life that he still carried within him, even on the hardest days. For a moment, in the quiet of the alley, Nico didn't feel so alone. He wasn't the only one who had struggled, the only one who had fought to survive. The puppy too had a light inside it, and for a little while, they shared that light together. He said it with a quiet certainty, almost startling himself. "I'll call you Estrella." The puppy, now with a name, lifted her head, her bright eyes meeting his as if she understood. "Because in this darkness, you're the only thing that shines." In that moment, Nico and Estrella were alone together, bound by something deeper than words, a quiet connection that made the bitter cold of the night and the heaviness of their lives feel a little less unbearable. That night, Nico decided not to return to the cramped corner he'd been calling home. Instead, he curled up beside Estrella in the same spot where he had found her, on the cold, cracked pavement, under the jagged outlines of broken buildings. He carefully covered her with his worn jacket, its fabric thin and torn from years of use, and lay down beside her, The small warmth of her body against his felt like a promise of protection, of companionship, of hope. Above them, the stars glowed faintly, distant and indifferent to the struggles of the world beneath them. But to Nico, those stars meant something more that night. They were silent witnesses to the beginning of a bond that, though he didn't realize it then, would change the course of his life forever. As he drifted off to sleep, Nico gently patted Estrella and whispered, "I'll never let you feel hunger or cold again." And in that quiet moment, their story began. A story of friendship that would endure hardship, loss, and even fate itself beneath the endless sky of stars. When the first light of dawn crept over the ruined city, Nico woke to the feel of Estrella's warmth against his chest. The streets outside were still empty, the remnants of the night's chill lingering in the air. Estrella was still asleep, her tiny body rising and falling with each breath, her face peaceful in the silence. Nico stayed still for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It was a brief moment of peace, before the reality of their situation returned. Slowly, careful not to disturb her, Nico rose to his feet. He had no time to waste. They needed to keep moving. The streets were still quiet, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. Nico's stomach growled loudly, a reminder of the hunger gnawing at him. But he didn't think about his own need for food. His mind was focused entirely on Estrella. She depended on him now, and that gave him a new sense of purpose. They walked together through the empty streets, the world around them still half asleep. Nico knew where he could find work, even if it was only for a few pennies. They passed the auto repair shop, its doors shut tight. But Nico knew he could always find scraps, old metal parts, screws, things he could sell. They passed the bakery too, where he had once been allowed to clean the windows in exchange for hard, stale bread. The tasks didn't seem as heavy with Estrella beside him. Her tiny paws patterned along the pavement, and there was something comforting in the way she seemed so carefree, as if the world was still full of wonder. When they reached the town square, a few men were already gathered, waiting for work. Nico walked up to the foreman, a man he'd spoken to before. "Morning, Nico," the foreman greeted him, his voice gruff but kind. "There's not much work today, but if you want, you can clean the tools for me. I'll get you something to eat." It wasn't much, but it was something. Nico nodded and got to work, cleaning the heavy tools, his hands stiff from the cold. Estrella ran around, chasing leaves and sniffing at the ground, her joy infectious. Nico watched her for a moment, her energy a bright spot in the grey world around them. Despite everything, she was happy, and in that, Nico found comfort. When he finished, the foreman handed him a small bag. Inside were a few bruised apples and some scraps of bread. The man grinned and said, "Take care, kid, and watch after that puppy. She looks like a good companion." Nico smiled, nodding his thanks, and took Estrella by the collar. With the small gift of food carefully tucked into his backpack, they walked away from the square, seeking out a quieter corner of the town. There they sat down together and shared the meal. Nico ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Estrella quickly finished hers, her tail wagging as she looked up at him, her eyes full of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for that, Nico felt a deep, quiet gratitude. Days passed in a blur of work, small victories, and moments of joy. Life on the streets was still tough, but Estrella made everything a little easier. She was always by his side, offering comfort in the form of her warmth, her energy, and her presence. When the cold grew unbearable, they found shelter in abandoned buildings or empty train stations, huddling together for warmth. Nico would watch Estrella curl up next to him, her small body a source of peace in the storm that was his life. And as the days went on, something inside him began to change. Before Estrella, the days had blurred together, each one a grey, monotonous struggle. But now, every day was different. There was a purpose to each one, a reason to keep going, and Estrella, with her playful energy, gave him something to look forward to. Her joy was a light in his darkness, a reminder that even in the hardest times, there was still room for happiness. Nico held on to that light with everything he had, and as he watched Estrella run, her small legs carrying her with carefree abandon, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Nico wandered through the quiet neighborhood one late afternoon. The sound of children laughing and kicking a soccer ball caught his attention. They played in an open, dusty lot, reminding him of the days he used to play too, before life took him down a harder road. Estrella, his small, scruffy puppy, noticed the ball and immediately started barking, her tiny body spinning in circles, eager to chase after it. Nico couldn't help but grin at her excitement. "We don't have time to play, Estrella," he whispered, though his own legs itched to join the game. The kids glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with indifference. Nico knew how they saw him, just the homeless kid, always alone. But with Estrella by his side for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so invisible. He thought back to the night he found her, both of them cold and scared beneath an old bridge. Since then, life was still tough, but no longer hopeless. Estrella gave him a reason to face each new day. She needed him, and he needed her. It was a bond that made the struggles feel lighter, even if just a little. Hunger, the bite of cold nights, and the fear of tomorrow still haunted him. But now Nico faced them with a quiet strength, knowing he wasn't alone. Estrella had brought more than just company. She had brought hope, even if it was just a flicker. Life could change. Where once the world ignored him, now people seemed to notice the boy and his puppy. Together, they were slowly creating a sense of home, a place where they mattered, despite everything. It's amazing how an abandoned puppy could chase away the darkest clouds. Nico looked at Estrella, then down at the worn wallet he'd found earlier, its soft leather clutched tightly in his hand. He pressed it to his chest, feeling the weight of the money inside. "Estrella, we could really use this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This money could change our lives, even just for a little while." Estrella wagged her tail, her happy, carefree spirit undisturbed by the difficult choices Nico faced. She lived in the moment, enjoying each second at his side while Nico's mind wrestled with the decision. He knew what was right. His mother had always told him, "Do the right thing, even when no one's watching." The memory of her voice echoed in his mind, giving him the clarity he needed. After a long pause, Nico finally stood up, his decision made. He tucked the money back into the wallet, then slipped it inside his jacket. "Let's go, Estrella," he murmured, gently running his fingers through her fur. His voice was steady, though a mix of relief and sadness weighed on him. "We need to find the owner of this wallet." He knew things wouldn't get easier right away, but at least he could face himself and Estrella knowing he had chosen the right path. As they walked out of the park, Nico looked up at the sky. The last of the clouds had cleared, and the sun now bathed the streets in a golden glow. It felt like the universe itself was smiling at his choice. Though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, Nico felt like he had taken a step towards something better, something beyond just surviving. Choosing honesty had given him a sense of power. Without knowing it, this small act of kindness was about to change their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Nico and Estrella began their search for Ernesto Ramirez. Finding Don Ernesto wasn't easy. All Nico had was an old faded ID card with Ernesto's name and a barely legible address. Still, Nico walked the city streets for hours, asking shopkeepers and passers-by if they knew the man. Most shook their heads or offered vague, uninterested responses, but Nico's determination didn't waver. The decision he had made at the park kept him moving forward. Finally, as the day was drawing to a close, Nico caught the attention of an elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small corner store. The man paused when Nico mentioned the name Ernesto Ramirez. "You're looking for Don Ernesto?" the old man asked, leaning on his broom, eyes narrowing with interest. "Yes, sir," Nico replied, his voice firm despite his tiredness. "I found something that belongs to him, and I want to return it." The man gave Nico a quick look, as if trying to figure out if he was being honest, then nodded slowly. "Don Ernesto lives in a small house with a garden full of flowers at the end of this street. He's a good man, but since his wife passed away, he's been living alone. You'll probably find him at home. He doesn't go out much." Nico felt a wave of relief. His search was almost over. He was nearly done with his task. Grateful to the old man, he and Estrella headed to the house. When Nico arrived at the house, he knew he was in the right place. The little garden was filled with colorful flowers standing out against the dull winter streets. Even though the house was small, it was well kept, reflecting the personality of its owner. Nico walked up to the door and knocked. A few seconds later, he heard slow, heavy footsteps. A white-haired old man with deep wrinkles and bright, kind eyes opened the creaky door. "Can I help you, young man?" the old man asked in a firm but gentle voice. Nico swallowed hard, realizing how serious the moment was. He pulled a wallet from his pocket, his hands shaking. "I think this is yours, sir," he said. "I found it in a park, and I should have returned it sooner." Don Ernesto looked surprised. His eyes moved from the wallet to Nico. With trembling hands, he took the wallet, as if he couldn't believe it. When he opened it and checked inside, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. "How did you find my wallet?" Don Ernesto asked, still processing what was happening. Nico glanced at his dog, Estrella, who was watching from the door. "My dog found it in some bushes," Nico explained shyly. "At first, I thought about keeping the money, but I knew it wasn't right. So I decided to find you." A deep silence followed Nico's words. Don Ernesto just stared at him, moved by the boy's honesty. It had only been a few days since he lost the wallet, and he thought it was gone forever. Most people would have kept the money, especially someone in Nico's situation, but this boy had made the right choice. Don Ernesto's voice shook as he finally spoke. "I don't know what to say. Your kindness truly caught me off guard. Please, young man, come inside. I'd love to hear more about your story." Nico hesitated for a moment, but the warmth in Don Ernesto's eyes reassured him. As he stepped inside, the cozy home greeted him with the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the faint, comforting scent of dried flowers. The house felt alive, radiating warmth through its old walls. Estrella, with her gentle paws, followed closely, her nose twitching as she explored the new space, tail wagging softly. Don Ernesto led him to a snug little living room. The furniture was worn but inviting, like it had been lived in for years, holding memories in its faded fabric. They sat in soft, cushioned chairs that had long ago lost their newness, but offered the kind of comfort that comes from being well used. Nico was handed a steaming cup of tea, the warmth spreading through his fingers, while Estrella was given a bowl of fresh water that she lapped up happily. As they sat, Nico shared his story. He spoke of the hardships he had faced, how he became homeless, how Estrella came into his life like a little spark of hope. His voice was steady, but his heart raced as he recounted how, despite his struggles, he made the decision to return the wallet. Don Ernesto listened intently, his weathered face thoughtful, his eyes never leaving Nico's as the boy spoke. He nodded at times, quietly absorbing every word. When Nico finished, a thoughtful silence filled the room. Don Ernesto leaned forward, his deep brown eyes shining with understanding and empathy. "Nico," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "what you did today shows a strength of character that many people twice your age don't have. It's easy to take what doesn't belong to us when we're struggling, But you chose the harder path. And that, my boy, says everything about the kind of person you are." Nico felt a lump form in his throat as he lowered his gaze. Don Ernesto's words made him think of his mother, and for a moment he wondered if she'd be proud of him. It was a bittersweet thought, but one that filled him with quiet pride. "I want to thank you, Nico," Don Ernesto said after a pause. "Not just for returning my wallet, but for showing me that there's still kindness in the world." He smiled softly, his wrinkles deepening. "You know, maybe it wasn't an accident that we met today. My wife passed away, and I've been alone ever since. I don't have any family left. But you reminded me today that we're not as alone as we might think." Don Ernesto stood up slowly, making a decision on the spot. "In return for your honesty, I'd like to offer you something that isn't money. I want you and Estrella to stay here with me. This house is too big for just one person. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know I don't want to spend it alone. And I don't think you should either." Nico was stunned. He hadn't expected this. He never imagined that returning a lost wallet would lead to such a life-changing moment. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so uncertain. He glanced at Estrella, who had already made herself comfortable on the floor, curled up in a sunny patch by the window, her tail gently thumping against the floor as if she knew this was home now. "What do you say, Nico?" Don Ernesto asked, his smile warm and hopeful. "Would you like to live here with me in a real home?" Tears welled up in Nico's eyes. He nodded slowly, unable to speak as emotion overwhelmed him. The weight of the struggles he had carried for so long seemed to lift, replaced by the warmth of gratitude and relief. Estrella, sensing the significance of the moment, stood up and gently licked Nico's fingers, her dark eyes soft and understanding. "Yes, sir," Nico managed to say through his tears, his voice trembling with emotion. "I would love to stay with you." And so, Nico and Estrella's new chapter began in the little house with the flower-filled garden. They had found more than just shelter. They had found a home, a family born from an act of honesty and kindness. In that small, cozy house, surrounded by the bright colors of the garden, Nico found the peace he had been searching for. Every morning, Nico woke up feeling a deep sense of gratitude. As he lay in his warm bed with Estrella curled up beside him, he thought about how far he had come. He and Don Ernesto grew close, sharing stories, laughter, and simple joys. The quiet moments they spent together filled the house with life once again. Each day as Nico looked at the vibrant flowers in the garden, their colors bursting against the backdrop of the clear blue sky, he felt a deep sense of peace. By choosing to do what was right, he had found a future more beautiful than anything he could have imagined.